I want to introduce a new notion, or a notion I've been working on recently, and maybe you can help me with it. I'm not entirely satisfied with it, but I'm more satisfied with it than some people. And it goes like this. If what we are caught in, see, my problem was always I saw this tremendous transformation ahead of us, but I always, as strong as my intuition of the transformation, was also my resistance to the miraculous, so that I didn't want the transformation to be that ships the size of New Jersey come from the galactic center and appear over every city on Earth, or that Atlantis rises from beneath the waves and the crystal tablets reveal the correct agenda. Or I always thought that these things were sort of hokey. And so as a rationalist, as an ex-Catholic, I was trying to imagine the incorporeal essence walking around on city streets, and how could that happen? Well, the clue was given to me recently when I was asked to review a book that hasn't been published yet, but will be soon, and I urge you all to get it. It's just a hoot. A friend of mine, Nick Herbert, the outlaw physicist, as he loves to call himself. And the book, if it's titled as tentatively titled, will be called Faster Than Light. And it was sent to me by the publisher, so I would say something nice about it, and they would put it on the back. And I am a connoisseur of faster-than-light schemes, as probably most of us were when we were 14 years old. And let me tell you, this guy has dug up stuff you have never heard of. It's not the old, Minnie is in ship A, Maxie is in ship B, they pass each other, each going the same. No, it's much better than that. But one of the things that he talked about was the feasibility of time machines. And I have always been interested in the Mandayan cosmology, which Mandayans are a sect that arose probably around Jerusalem somewhere in the early Christian era. They claim they were founded by John the Baptist, but who knows? But anyway, they can be traced back to that milieu, and over the centuries they've had many wanderings and peregrinations and settled eventually, probably to their regret, in the swamps of Iraq and Iran some 3 centuries ago. And what shape they are in the aftermath of this war, I have not heard, I have no idea. Perhaps they're extinct. It cannot have been a happy experience for them. But anyway, very rich, very old tradition, and they have the notion in their cosmology of a Messiah, which they call the secret Adam. And the secret Adam will come at the end of the world. And the Mandayan notion of what's going on is that we all have a soul made of light, and the light is trapped in matter. This universe is not our home. This universe is a kind of hell in which we wander, and the purpose of religion is to teach people about the light inside themselves and how to gather it together and how to get it out of this universe and into our rightful home, which is a much better place. Okay? So the Mandayan eschaton is that this Messiah called the secret Adam will come, but what's unusual is that the secret Adam teaches no message, has no point of view, but builds a machine. They specifically say this, builds an object of some sort, and the object operationally could be described as a light pump. The light pump of the Mandayan Messiah then gathers the light of all souls that have lived or are living, and transmits the light first to the sun, no, first to the moon, then to Venus, then to the sun, and then out of this universe entirely to the higher and hidden presence of the All-Father. Well, this is very interesting, especially to me, because I have very deeply ingrained in me the idea that these messianic scenarios, these end-of-the-world scenarios, are visions of future events being picked up by various holy seers, men and women of great depth of inner vision. And the Mandayan one, to my mind, is the only one that specifically mentions the building of an object rather than a moral reform of some sort. So I want to put out to you a notion that is definitely embryonic, but promising. And the idea came to me from Nick Herbert's book. Although just a few lines and rip him to the bone. But he asked the question, he wants to talk about time machines, and the first question he asks is, well, obviously if time travel were to be discovered at any point in the future, how come we don't see time travelers? Why aren't they coming and going?
I just flashed on the answer myself.
Tell me, and let me see if you got it right.
Yeah, the same one, because just like there are waveforms and currents and eddies in the ocean or something, this particular time we're in, historical time, is a time in which time machines don't seem to work too well. But time before this and after this, maybe they work quite well, so people can go back and forth, but they can't go through this part because it's the wrong kind of current.
B plus. Close. Well, that's the paranoid theory. That in fact there are time machines, and if you only knew where to look or who to ask, you would find that they're whizzing by. But this gentleman comes much closer to it, and you'll love the simplicity of this, I hope. The reason we don't see time machines coming and going is because we live in an era before time machines. And no time machine can go back in time earlier than the moment of the invention of the first time machine. So I had never considered this before and found it very interesting. And so I tried to imagine what would it then be like to be involved in the invention of the first time machine, because as you know, when we were in the Amazon in 1971, we attempted to build what we called a transdimensional vehicle, and we stressed that it would be basically a spaceship because we're spatial monkeys, and that was how we thought of it. But if you're really going to make good on a transdimensional vehicle, you also have to have a gear which takes you not to Arcturus but to yesterday. And so I tried to envision what this moment of constructing and launching the first time machine would be like. And I came up with a scenario something like this. It's late December of 2012 AD, and at the World Temporal Studies Institute on the banks of the Agara-Paraná in central Amazonas, technicians are putting the final touches on the first time machine. And the chief scientist chosen to pilot the time machine into the future is just donning her time suit and being escorted to the cockpit, and the hatches are being closed and the system checked out. Finally, everything is perfect. Just as dawn begins to break over the jungle, the button is pushed, and this woman sails off into the future. And there have been no prototypes, there have been no partial mock-ups, no preliminary tests, because in the nature of the thing, it just can't be done that way. Now, my question, most people I think at this point would want to follow this woman's career. What does she see as she moves off into the future? And what paradoxes does it generate? My concern was not with that. I wish her luck and turn my attention elsewhere, specifically back to the laboratory. I wanted to know what happens at that moment. And the first thing that occurred to me was, it seemed obvious, suddenly all over the earth, time machines will appear, coming from all sectors of the future. Why? Because they want to see the first voyage into time. They want to be present at this momentous event. It's as if you had an airplane that could travel in time. Well, this is a mixed metaphor, but wouldn't you fly to Kitty Hawk to be there to see the first powered flight of an aircraft? So at first I imagined that the skies and freeways of Earth would fill with travelers coming from the far future to explore the membrane, because that's the end of the road for time travelers. They can't go further back because before that moment, time machines were impossible and didn't exist. And I was troubled by this little science fiction scenario, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what the problem was. And then as I smoked more, I realized that the problem was that in what is the undoing of all time travel scenarios is what's called the kill your own grandfather paradox. This is very simply stated, and I'm sure familiar to most of you. If time travel were possible, I could go back in time and shoot my grandfather. If I shoot my grandfather, my mother is never born, therefore I am never born, therefore how could I go back in time and shoot my grandfather? I couldn't, therefore time travel is impossible. And I realized that in the kind of scenario I've just described to you, the grandfather paradox would come into play, because someone in century 8 after time travel, century 8 ATT, could go back to century 7 ATT and kill their grandfather and therefore not exist and therefore set the paradox in motion. So I ruminated on this problem, and finally I understood, or I at least had the illusion of understanding, how to resolve this paradox and how to solve a whole bunch of problems that I hadn't realized were even associated with what I was thinking about. And it is this. And I'm going to now make a spatial metaphor about a temporal situation. I want you to think of today, the present world situation, where we have rainforest, very pre-literate rainforest hunter-gatherer cultures on the same planet as Los Angeles and Tokyo, existing in the same temporal moment. Well, now what's happening in the modern world? Isn't what is happening, and rather quickly, is that the accomplishments, values, attitudes, and desires of the people of Tokyo, Los Angeles, and Manhattan are completely swamping all other values. The rainforest Indian doesn't want to be a better shaman. He wants better reception on his transistor radio. The rainforest shaman doesn't want to learn how to make fish traps. He wants to learn how to repair Hondas. What is happening in the world today is that the values of the most advanced cultures are completely swamping and eclipsing all other values. And I think that this would happen in a world where time travel were possible, so that this has a very odd effect. Now let's go back to our scenario at dawn of 2012 AD. We send our Lady Temponaut off into the future, and a microsecond later, what happens is not the appearance of time travelers from all eras of the future. What happens a moment later is the appearance all over the earth of the most advanced state possible within the complete set of the entire future. In other words, if human development culminates 10 million years in the future in some kind of unimaginable biomechanical, transcendental, apocalypse of some sort, or apotheosis of some sort, that state will immediately appear on the other side of the membrane a microsecond after the first person moves off into the future. In other words, the discovery of time travel ends history forever. And there is no history. In effect, inventing this kind of time travel will cause the entirety of the future to happen instantly. It will undergo some kind of compression in the same way that time and matter undergo a compression toward infinity inside the black hole. So what this means, if we can take it seriously, even as a metaphor, is that if a way were found to transfer information into the future, and if time travel works in such a way that information then from the future could be transferred into the past as far as the moment of the invention of the first time machine, then what you effectively have is all the resources of the entire future history of our species coming available to us a millisecond after we invent this kind of a device. It is a perfect and extreme example of what I call the forward escape. It's essentially a siren. We're building a siren which calls the resources of future humanity, millions and millions of years in the future, into the late 20th century or early 21st century historical situation. And it does it without the intervention of flying saucers, without the violation of natural law, without the summoning of galactic ecologists to come in flying saucers. It explains then, it is the generation of the perfect tool. It explains how the cultural process of tool making ends in its own self-transcendence. And if you're wondering, what does this have to do with psychedelics and shamanism? Well, what it has to do with it is that in the same way in quantum physics as you get virtual tunneling, where a particle appears mysteriously on the other side of an energy barrier without ever having acquired enough energy to pass over the barrier, so that it's said that it tunneled back. I think information from this hyper-temporal domain beyond the end of history, a very small amount of this information tunnels backward naturally as a kind of leaky process, and that this is what shamanism and religious sensitivity and poetry and everything that characterizes our humanism is about. We are quite literally that animal that can sense the future, and being able to sense it over the past 100,000 years, we have gone in search of it. in the same way that an animal can smell water on the wind and can then go in search of water and eventually find the water hole, because of our large brain capacity, because information is a quantum mechanically expressed state in the brain, we can smell the future and have been able to do so for 50, 60,000 years. And I think the thing which amplifies this state are the psychedelic plants. This is how the boundary dissolving works that I've taught. All of these things have to be seen in more and more and more concrete terms. These are not metaphors. When we say the psychedelic dissolves boundaries, we're not only talking about boundaries like between you and me, we're talking about boundaries like between past and future. So the shamanic vision is actually an anticipation of the future state of the human species. And as well, we can make several kinds of metaphors. Since we don't know what this information-bearing particle is, which runs backward against the continuum of time, we can hypothesize that it encounters resistance, so that as you approach it, let's call it the water hole or hyperspace, there is more and more information about it. So that the shaman getting loaded 100,000 years ago has only the faintest flickering intimation of something. And the shaman getting stoned 10,000 years ago says, there's more of it. It's getting clearer. I can feel it. I can taste it. And the shaman getting stoned now just has to hold his or her head and stand the intensity of this wind of information blowing out of hyperspace and carrying with it an image of the transcendence of our species. And the strange thing is that human decisions, human acts will determine when we enter into this domain as a fully realized cultural artifact. It is the philosopher's stone, which informed the mystical visions of the 16th century. They were that close to it. And now we are so close to it that we not only encounter it in dreams and in drug states, but under certain conditions of isolation and not even isolation, we see it in the sky. We see machines apparently made of matter in the sky. This is what the UFO is. It is an intimation of the future history of humanity haunting the skies of Earth like an image. And so as we approach this singularity, and I, for reasons that are mathematical and too complex to lay out here, I accept the end of the Mayan calendar, the December 22nd, 2012 date, and think that's a very reasonable end date to assign to this process. And what we must do is create metaphors so that we understand this. And I feel that's what my function is to talk about this information flowing out of the future and try and create metaphors, linguistic nets that can hold it. Because to the degree that we can assure ourselves and communicate among ourselves that this is happening, we can lose some of our anxiety about what is happening to our species and this planet. I mean, we are involved in the execution of an extremely complex acrobatic performance. I mean, this is, the triple backflip. And there is risk and there is tension, but I believe that the information flowing into our heads through the amplification of these psychedelic molecules tells us that we do succeed. We will succeed. It is accomplished. And that is the thread which holds it all together. So we need not doubt. We need not fear. We need merely to trim our edges, to participate more smoothly in the process whose eventual success we are already receiving intimation of. We all, or it's generally agreed, I think, that there is this compression going on, that everything is being more densely connected, more densely expressed. Well, if you again, to use the black hole model, what happens in the center of a black hole is that matter becomes infinitely compressed. Well, the term infinitely compressed doesn't mean anything, so then what astrophysicists say is, well, there must then be in another universe a white hole, and the matter in the center of the black hole spurts into this other universe and begins to define a new topology. Well, if what's happening to us is a kind of cultural convergence on infinite density, well, then at some point, to avoid becoming a tautology or to avoid generating a contradiction, the information will simply begin to expand into another dimension. In other words, it will have filled this dimension, and yet there's still more stuff coming in, so it has to go somewhere. So then, like the matter breaking out and defining a new topology like a white hole, it breaks out and begins to fill the future. So you have not exactly time travel, but just simply the need to generate another dimension, a dimension orthogonal to the axes of all the other dimensions that you were previously. And this is what happens when a system complexifies beyond a certain point, beyond the point where it can be described. Then a formalist would say, well, there are additional dimensions, therefore we have to add additional descriptive vectors, and we can add as many of these descriptive vectors as there are dimensions needing describing. In fact, the formal understanding of what a dimension is simply a variable. It's not mysterious. You can have a 23-dimensional system if you have 23 variables. There is a language problem here because our language is not designed to deal with this stuff. Our language assumes... let me say one more thing about singularities. Most theories require them, and then it's how you handle it that determines how graceful the theory is. The current quote-unquote orthodox paradigm is what's called, and I'm sure you know all about it, the Big Bang model. And this asks you to believe in one major singularity. It occurs at the very instant. The first thing that happens is a singularity. And the universe springs from nothingness. The entire universe, all that we can see, all that we cannot see, is in this stage considerably smaller than a dime. In fact, considerably smaller than a dime. It is the diameter of a proton. And then there is, and once you grant this extremely unlikely situation, then the laws of physics can be plugged in, and this thing expands, and light, and all these things happen. But this is a tremendous unlikelihood, this springing of the universe from nothing. It in fact differs not at all from the first words of Genesis, In the beginning was the Word. Let there be light. It is a complete fait accompli, a complete Deus ex machina intercession. It is just, it happens, don't ask why, all consequences proceed from it. It is the primary fact, therefore questions can be asked about it in terms of metaphysical questions. Well, my notion is that singularities are possible, but it would seem to me they are more likely in complex situations rather than simple situations. And the situation before the universe existed is the simplest situation that it is possible to conceive of. No time, no space, no energy, no matter, no topological manifold of any sort. In other words, a nothingness that would make a Buddhist blush precedes this thing. So it is, it is the simplex, as they call it in alchemy. It is the simplest of the simple. Well, how the hell out of that situation are you supposed to have a universe of the size and complexity of ours spring for no reason? Seems to me far more likely that if you're going to get a singularity, it's going to be in a universe filled with complexity of every level, of every kind, all kinds of radiation, all kinds of coding systems, all kinds of molecular systems, all kinds of self-reflecting animal life, all kinds of self-propagating plants. In other words, a universe rather like our own. This is the kind of universe where it's possible something completely astonishing could emerge, and then after it had emerged and was fully documented, then people would say, well, of course, you realize the background situation was so complex that we should have expected something like this. And so I would be more comfortable with placing a singularity like the Philosopher's Stone, the hypothetical time machine, the emergence into hyperspace, in a very, very complex situation. And I think that the situation we're in is the most complex we know of, and it's getting more complex all the time and rapidly. So I think that indicates that we are caught, locked in the gravitational field, if you will, or the novelty field of an immensely novel object of some sort that lies ahead of us on the temporal axis, and that what we call history is the deepening tug on a primate species of a singularity which over 100,000 years is going to take that primate species, whip it through a phase of historical development that will deepen and deepen and complexify, and then finally inject it into a modality completely different from anything that it's ever known. And to the degree that we can raise this process to consciousness, we can shed our anxiety, shed our masculine ego, because the masculine ego does not believe this story that I've told you this morning. It's humdrum, cut and dried, kill or be killed, lay in your food for the winter, hold down the dreaming, but keep away from the large metaphors, try and stay with the here and now, sharpen your blades, keep your powder dry, so forth and so on. But the boundary dissolution that we all can experience by submitting ourselves to the atemporal information bank of the planet, which is what the psychedelics are the antenna to, the morphogenetic fields of the planet, past, present, and future, are what are being transmitted out of the vegetable matrix and into animal life. And animal life is a kind of being lost in time, a kind of victimized state. I mean, it's the price for modality, it's the price we pay for having such a complex sexual process that we cannot just propagate ourselves by cutting off an arm and putting it in the ground and having it grow into a person. We have instead a very complex and different kind of strategy that makes us extremely focused on what we call the present moment. It makes us extremely fearful about the future and extremely prone to forget the past.
Are we making an assumption here that time and history are linear and fixed? It seems like you wouldn't have the paradox of the grandfather killing if, let's say, the time travel is possible and you go to the past and kill your grandfather, but time isn't fixed and linear, that there would be a different past happen, and the fact that there wouldn't, that just a whole concept where there wouldn't be a paradox, where there would be a situation where you could go into and be born from your grandfather linearly or whatever in that way, and then you go back and kill that person, but then time would change, but you could still have done it, because it's not a linearity.
Well, that's a multiple universe theory, I guess.
Well, you can touch on that, but...
yeah, I mean, you're right, and you're right. This is a kind of version of the Wheeler multiple universe theory. What I've always shared, the aversion to that theory of straight scientists, because the fact that you have to hypothesize an entire universe springing into being every time a choice is made seemed to me to violate Occam's Razor. Occam's Razor says hypotheses should not be multiplied without necessity, and it's simply a faith of modern science, but it's a faith I share that when we do get the final explanation, it will be elegant. It will be simple. It will have a kind of Zen-like severity. But I entertained ideas like you're talking about. Well, I have to confess, this kind of stuff makes my head ache, because I can't. But as long as I could preserve the notion, I loved the idea of a time, of a post-historical time where people decided not only where they would live, but when. And people would say, well, we're moving into the 26th century, and somebody else says, well, that's too hectic for us. We're going to hang out in the 22nd. We just can't relate to those 26th century people, you know. And imagine, and surely in the vast universe of science fiction, this has been done. Someone has imagined these kinds of universes where going from when to when is no bigger deal than going from place to place. But how the paradoxes...
Also, I was thinking about it in terms of your idea of it all arriving at the same time. I mean, okay, the time machine is invented, and at that moment, we break the membrane. Isn't that kind of, if you go for the grandfather clause, it's kind of a reverse grandfather clause. I mean, at that moment, do we have the time to live all of those future centuries in order for it to come back on us? Doesn't it all kind of go bloop? You know what I mean?
That's what I can't understand. There seems to be a paradox here. You invent the time machine, and somehow the compressed history of development post-time machine, you cause that all to collapse. And all those generations of people and empires and spacefaring and whatever it is suddenly just compressed into the next moment. How can that be?
Doesn't that sort of cancel it out almost?
Well, I think we may be exploring the ultimate tool of fuzzy thinking here. I've been accused of that. An example of this would be talking to a 19th century person and saying to them, did you know that in the 20th century anybody with sufficient money can decide to go to an airport and fly to Bangkok, Nome, Paris, Johannesburg, Jerusalem, and be there within 12 hours? They would say, well, how could anyone live in a world like that? Everybody will just be going everywhere. Everything will be so chaotic and confused. Well, it turns out it costs so much that not everybody is everywhere they want to be all the time. But ideally, and I think the cultural ideal is to make it cost less and less, that we actually accept this idea that everybody should be able to be anywhere they want, and a future society may accept the idea that people should have the right to be any when they want.